I've been using the M1 MacBook Air for over 2 months at work, and we all know that the M2 MacBook Air is just around the corner. So in this video, I wanted to consider if it's possible if that MacBook has water and dust resistance. Now, if you're new to this channel, I'm an engineering manager who talks about engineering, endurance, health, philosophy, and a lot more. But in this video, I just want to take a common sense approach to reasoning about whether the new MacBook Air may or may not have water and dust resistance. And this question's been on my mind, especially since I've purchased this MacBook Pro for myself, primarily for video editing and my own personal development and use like that. So since I've had this laptop and I've got to be able to compare it with the work MacBook Air, I just want to go over this question about whether the new MacBook Air can possibly have dust and water resistance. Okay, so first a word on some timelines. It's obvious looking back that Apple spent a lot of time re-engineering the internals of this machine to go from Intel to M1, but kept the body of the design the same. So the external of this M1 MacBook Air looks exactly like the previous MacBook Air, except for a few changes in terms of the fan, etc. But the body of the laptop is the same. Now, engineering management wise, this is a nice decision because it allows you to spend all that time on the gargantuan effort it is to go from Intel to M1, and it allows you to not worry about the problem of also changing the outer body of the MacBook. So you can focus all the engineering effort on just the one activity, the one that will make the biggest splash, and that is the internals being reworked. But then when we saw the MacBook Pro, we saw that there was a bit of a redesign, or at least externally it appears that there was a bit of a redesign in that there is now a notch on the display and the whole body is a bit thicker, and I'm sure that they've worked something internally as well. But outside it looks like they've made quite a few changes. Oh, and the ports are of course back. So I do think that a new M2 MacBook Air being redesigned might be a highly likely situation, especially emphasizing on the redesign part. And throughout this video, I'm calling it the MacBook Air, and there are rumors of this new laptop being called just the MacBook, but I'm just going to refer to it as the MacBook Air throughout this video because that's just to make sure that we're talking about this laptop, the entry-level M1 Silicon Apple laptop. Additionally, henceforth, I'm going to be referring to the upcoming laptop as the M2 MacBook Air, but this can also equally apply to the M3 or the M4. I'm not particularly sure about what the timelines are going to be, but I'm just referring.
Connecting to the internet for more info.
My God. It started off again.
I'm having trouble connecting to the internet. For more info, check the Home app.
I have a mic. I have this mic plugged in, so I can't just get up and go unplug this thing, but it is so irritating to have Siri just wanting to interrupt into conversation, especially when I'm talking to my team or to clients on a video call or whatever, and now it's even in the videos. But anyway, we'll give it another shot. Henceforth, I'll be referring to the upcoming MacBook Air as the M2 MacBook Air, but I'm not really sure about the internal timelines of what Apple has planned. This may be for the M3 or the M4, but the point is, this laptop, as you'll soon find, can play to its strength, which is it doesn't have a vent. Okay, so let's start exploring the idea. But first, let's talk about why would Apple want to introduce dust or water resistance to a laptop. I'm not at all implying that people will start taking these laptops and dunking them into water, although I'm sure that some YouTube tech reviewer will try that for sure. But it is more on the lines of people spilling something on the keyboard, and we all know people who've done that. I had done that when I was a child on another laptop that I'd owned, a Sony Vaio, I think, RIP the Vaio series. And on the other hand, we also know of people who want to use their laptops in particularly dusty environments. So these are things like people who want to use their laptops on a beach. Here in India, when I was in Delhi, it's a very polluted city and the air is not very clean. So even if I sat out on a terrace and tried to use my laptop for some programming or something, I would just not risk it at all because there is just so much dust in the air, and the MacBook Pro that I was using at the time would spin up the fans and I would be very worried about the dust that gets settled into the machine, so I just wouldn't risk it. But dust getting in that way in the laptop is another reason why dust resistance would be a good idea on a laptop. So it's for these reasons that a laptop like this going dust and water resistant, just generally called ingress resistance, would be a good idea. Okay, so the reason I think that this MacBook Air or successors of this MacBook Air might have ingress resistance is because there is no vent on this laptop. There's no fan, there is no need for air to go in and out of this machine at all. And technically speaking, that makes it so that this laptop has no reason to have any openings anymore, even though this particular model might have openings in the keyboards and speakers and such. And so next, let's start going over reasons why typically one would not be comfortable with introducing ingress resistance on a laptop like this. We look at 4 components of this laptop that currently make it so that it isn't ingress resistant. Number 1 is going to be the display and the hinge. Number 2 is the keyboard. Number 3 is the speakers. And number 4 is the ports. So let's get started. Now, as we begin, keep in mind the iPhone and the Galaxy Fold phones. I'm going to use both these phones as examples of how ingress protection can theoretically be achieved in a MacBook Air. First, let's start with the speaker and the ports. Clearly, the iPhone has both a speaker, a mic, and it even has a lightning connector. And the iPhone is both water and dust resistant. Not only that, the iPhone also has a SIM card slot, which is an actual component that comes in and out and is, I think, the most modular part of the iPhone, simply because you can take it out, replace a SIM card, and then put it back and the phone continues to function. So the iPhone is modular in that sense. And if the phone can have a speaker and a lightning port, then clearly those are not arguments enough to not have ingress resistance. Next, let's talk about the hinge and the display. Now, the display is no factor because from the top to the bottom, the whole thing is sealed anyway, so there is no reason for any opening in this whole display chassis. The hinge is a part that actually does move, and this is the portion where the Galaxy Fold comes into the picture. The Galaxy Fold has, in my opinion, a tougher hinge to develop ingress protection for, and yet the Galaxy Fold is able to do it. And I say that the Galaxy Fold has a tougher hinge because there's actually a screen on top of it, and yet if they are able to manage ingress protection, then clearly the display and the hinge is not a factor for not having ingress protection on this laptop. Okay, so lastly, let's visit the keyboard of this laptop, which in my opinion makes the strongest case against ingress protection engineering wise. And if you look at the keyboard here, all the keys on a keyboard are essentially just buttons. A button's job is to send an electric signal to a computer whenever the key is depressed. So that is what the keyboard does, and if you think about it, that is exactly what the iPhone volume switch also does. You press it down and there is an electrical signal received, and based on that electrical signal, something happens and the display updates in a certain way. On the iPhone, the volume control either goes up or down, and on the keyboard, whatever key you've pressed gets entered into a text editor or whatever it is you're doing. Now, I know you'll say that the iPhone's volume key has nothing at all in common with how it feels when you type on your keyboard and press the keys, and I would agree with that. But the key feel and the pressing of the button, how it feels to the finger, has nothing to do with the electrical signal portion of it, which is what we're concerned with ingress protection, and whether you can make it so that that electrical signal can still be transferred and none of these elements can get into that socket or the dome that's housing either the button or the key. The mechanics of a button or a key have more to do with the mechanics of how it gets depressed when you are pressing it, or to do with the surface and how it has been created. I am only concerned with the electrical portion of what happens after that, and clearly the button is also able to perform underwater. And in fact, you'll find a lot of these buttons all around you in watches as well. For example, the Garmin watch that I'm wearing right now, you can operate the buttons of this watch underwater, and even the Apple Watch, which is a smartwatch more people are familiar with compared to at least a Garmin, can be operated underwater, and you can press those buttons underwater. Whether something happens with it or not, that is a whole different question. But looking at it purely from the perspective of the physics and the electrical components, you can press those buttons underwater and the watch is not going to get a water or dust inside it. And as for the trackpad on these laptops, they haven't really been a physical moving part since 2015 when they introduced it on the MacBook Pro. So that should be no factor. Either the Apple Watch can have its screen operated underwater, and even that is a surface that you can press and have force touch on the same way you have it on the laptop, and that is no problem either. So I'm not saying that the trackpad is completely waterproof already, but it is not a moving part and you can in theory seal it. Now, I'm in no way suggesting that all of this is going to be easy or it can just be done at the flick of a switch. but instead that theoretically it is possible to have this MacBook Air go water and dust resistant in a way that you just can't achieve on the MacBook Pro, because the MacBook Pro has fans and it has vents, it has inlets over here and outlets right there. And so because of the cooling, the MacBook Pro will always need vents unless they're able to achieve the same performance along with no vents at all. Now, whether Apple chooses to add ingress protection to their laptops is a whole different story. We all know people who spill water on their laptops purely because they're either using it in a kitchen or in a bathroom, or they're out and about and it starts raining. But people who have spilled water or some liquid on their keyboard, etc., are not nearly as common. And I would imagine that the cost of re-engineering all of these components to now have gaskets, to either change the way they work fundamentally or something like that, is definitely not going to be cheap. However, Apple doesn't really shy away from costly investments because they do pay off in the long run and they can charge a premium for their devices. The other reason why I think that ingress protection may not come to the upcoming MacBook Air is the MacBook Pro. You see, Apple's branding game is really strong. If they introduced ingress protection on the Air and not on the Pro, and in fact never be able to introduce it on the Pro because of the requirement of the vent, this would really confuse the branding aspect of the thing. The MacBook Air would be a great laptop with ingress protection. The MacBook Pro would be a great laptop that's a little faster, has more ports than the MacBook Air, but it doesn't have ingress protection, and in fact it can never have ingress protection unless this vent goes away. And the Pro line, given that it is more powerful and therefore might produce more heat all the way into the future generations of this laptop, may never even have ingress protection. This is typically not the strategy that Apple takes in the versions of products that it creates. Apple's strategy is typically good, better, best. So you have iPhone, iPhone Pro, iPhone Pro Max, or it is good, best. MacBook Air, MacBook Pro. You typically don't find the best version of a product Apple makes being inferior to a good version of a product Apple makes. So in this case, the MacBook Pro would not have ingress protection and the MacBook Air will. Add to that the user expectation angle. Let's say Apple releases a MacBook Air with ingress protection and people get comfortable with the idea that spilling water on this thing is no factor and it's no problem at all. And let's say that the same non-technical user goes ahead and upgrades their MacBook Air to a MacBook Pro and then has the same user expectation that, oh, any laptop that Apple makes is completely fine to have water spilled on. What they would result in is a MacBook Pro that is liquid cooled and it just doesn't switch on. I'm sorry, I just had to make that water cooling joke. With all of this laid out, I hope you appreciate the kind of thinking that goes behind creating a product like this. Great engineering is equally about should you do it as it is about can you do it. Okay, so that's all for this video. Given that everything we've gone over, I do think that the M2 MacBook Air might be a very aggressive timeline for getting ingress protection if it ever even comes to this line of laptops, and I'm quite sure that the redesign of this laptop will sell like hotcakes, so they can save that feature and the development of that feature for another year, maybe the M3, M4, who knows if it ever even comes. But I'm a fan of great engineering and I am looking forward to whatever it is that they introduce in the M2 line of laptops. So I'm looking forward to whatever it is they release in the M2 MacBook. If you like this video, do the like and subscribe thing for the algorithm. It really helps out my channel. It's a budding channel at this point. Take care and I'll see you in the next one.